This is a short guide to how I undertake bucket flotation in the field. This is not a definitive guide, but just one way in which you can easily process environmental samples. The basic principle behind the retrieval of carbonised plant remains is that when soil is put into water and gently agitated, any carbonised remains will float to the surface. The material that sinks is then called the heavy residue, and the material that floats to the top is called the light fraction or flot. To start, I usually get 5 to 10 buckets depending on how big the samples are and if I have any helpers. I also need a 1mm mesh to sieve the heavy residue and a mesh to collect the light fraction. I usually use a 250 micron mesh that I have made into these handy bags. You can also use a metal sieve where you tap out the light fraction after it's collected. This method is not shown here. You can go to a 0.5mm mesh, but it is not recommended to go any bigger as you will lose small seeds and seed fragments. We also show here a tray to dry the heavy residue, and we usually place this on newspaper or plastic sheets if the weather is hot. The first step is to take the soil sample collected and empty this into a bucket where you can measure the litres. Here you want to make sure you have at least 2 labels, one for the heavy residue and one for the flot. This is a good time to remove any heavy objects like large rocks and big pieces of pottery sherds. Once you have measured the sample and recorded this, you can then transfer the soil to the buckets. I usually like a maximum of 4 litres in a 12-litre bucket, but this may vary depending on the soil type. You may need to try a sample to see what the best soil to water ratio is. I usually like to attach the heavy residue label to the bucket so it's clear what sample is there, and then remove and add to the heavy residue when it's processed. The second label will go into the bucket or straight into the flot bag or sieve. When you pour in the sample, you may see things instantly start floating to the surface. Anything black could potentially be charcoal or a carbonised plant remain. Carefully agitate the soil in a circular and up and down motion. If the soil has large lumps, gently break these up, but make sure you aren't crushing the soil as you may damage the remains. Charred plant remains and charcoal, when wet, become fragile and can be easily crushed. Continue until you think the soil is broken up enough to enable the remains to be released. Leave the bucket to stand for a few minutes to let some of the heavier sediment settle. To collect the light fraction, we use the 1mm sieve to support the smaller 250 micron mesh bags that were homemade for this job. You can also use metal sieves. We support the sieves on a bucket to collect the wastewater. The idea here is to collect all the material that is floating but stop all the mud and other materials at the bottom of the bucket from getting in. If you don't get everything the first time, keep adding water until you don't see anything floating. Use the water to remove anything that is stuck to the inside of the bucket. If you accidentally get too much sediment in the flot bag, this could mean that the soil to water ratio is too high, or you haven't let the sample settle enough. In this example, you can see that the sediment is quite fine, and so we were able to use a clean bucket of water to gently sieve the sample and clean the light fraction. The remains need to be as clean as possible to help the archaeobotanist in the lab, as dirty seeds can be difficult to identify. If the sample gets really clogged, you can get a clean bucket of water and refloat the sample. Once all the floaty bits have been collected from the sample, you can give the bag a quick rinse in a bucket of clean water and hang it to dry. If you have any metal sieves, you can tap out the sample onto kitchen paper and hang this out to dry. After this step, you will be left with the heavy residue. Here you take the 1mm sieve and wash everything out of the buckets. Once clean, you can place this on newspaper and a tray and leave to dry in the sun. Make sure both the heavy residue and the light fraction have labels. In the heavy residue you may see animal bones, fish bones and shells, and other small artefacts such as beads or small pieces of metal. If the soil is heavy clay, you may also find some charcoal and plant remains in the heavy residue where they become heavy and do not float. When you start a new sample, you need to make sure all the buckets and sieves are clean, as small plant remains can still be attached, contaminating any subsequent samples. Finally, I demonstrate removing the light fraction from the sieve bag. Here I kept the flot within some kitchen paper to help protect it for transportation, but you can also just pour the sample directly into the bag with the label. If the light fraction or heavy residue is not completely dry before placing in plastic bags, they can begin to sweat and can cause mould to form, destroying the fragile carbonised remains. If this happens, you should remove the samples and let them dry in a secure spot where they are protected. Or if the sample is sport, you may be able to just open the top of the bags to dry.